it's both appropriate and at one level ironic that we sit here in beautiful El Paso, Texas, one of the safest cities in the United States, when less than a mile away from us is some of the most unbelievable carnage that I think we've seen. The rates of murder that are happening across the river, just literally a couple of blocks from here, rival what we've seen in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And that violence is all driven entirely by the drug trade. So let's talk about it for just a little bit. And what I would tell you is that this forum, my compliments to the organizers, is important because understanding the true nature of the drug problem, the problem with illicit drugs is both a public health problem, it's a crime problem, it is a problem of transnational proportions and American national security. It's all these things and many more. And it's difficult to get your arms around with. Many people are very pessimistic about drug control in America and American drug control policy. And I think part of that, as we saw in the first presentation, really comes from a mental framework that I think doesn't work, and perhaps some of the most unfortunate words ever uttered in terms of drug control, and that's the war on drugs. I'll talk about that more later, but what I would say at this point is that, for those of us who come from a Christian background, the first controlled substance violation goes back to the Garden of Eden. When Eve tasted of the forbidden fruit, and we've been at it ever since. We will be at it for the rest of our lives. There's nobody in this room that won't be involved in a society where we're trying to regulate certain kinds of behavior. And ultimately, it is the responsibility of governments to protect their citizens. So while we may have disagreements about the best way to do that, what the correct balance is between treatment or law enforcement, ultimately what we're talking about is the obligation of the state, of the government, to protect its citizens. Speaking of the war metaphor, and if I can debunk that just for a little bit, we're not at war with our citizens. We can't go to war with inanimate objects. We're not at war with the cocaine itself or the contraband drug, whatever type it is. And wars have beginnings and ends. They have winners and losers, and we declare victory or we're defeated and we move on, it's over with. Perhaps a better analogy for this is really to talk about the government's ongoing responsibility to protect society and to really go after those who would peddle poison for profit. That's really what we're talking about. And I think probably if there's one key takeaway from this whole discussion, we've got many academics on the panel. I appreciate their perspectives on this, and what I would say is that drug trafficking is not, it's not bad because we happen to label it as such. In Latin, they would say malum prohibitum. It's wrong to drive over 55 miles an hour in a certain stretch of the highway because the government has labeled it as such, but it's not evil in itself to drive over 55 miles an hour. To sell poison for profit, to be engaged in the drug traffic that degrades humankind, that causes so much misery, is what we would say malum pro se, evil in and of itself. And I think that's the one thing that we can't lose sight of here, and I'll talk about that more. I think, it's said that picture tells 1,000 words, so I could talk to you about the millions of admissions into emergency department hospitals across the country, but I won't do that. I could talk to you about the percentage of people who test positive for drugs at the time of arrest. And these are not just people who are arrested for drugs, but there's a high correlation between people who are arrested for any crime and drug use. I won't do that. I could talk to you about treatment availability and how many people are in treatment for various kinds of drugs. And although we talk about marijuana as being a less dangerous kind of drug, as you can see there are hundreds of thousands, 300,000 people in treatment for marijuana abuse. I won't talk about that either. I could talk about the drug use testing, the so-called Quest data, and how many people in sensitive jobs test positive for the use of various kinds of drugs. We could talk about students, and we saw some of these graphs already, who are using drugs in the last year, in the last month, over their lifetime. We can talk about changes in price and purity of cocaine that have changed dramatically since President Calderon took office. The price of cocaine has more than doubled, up 104%, purity down 35%. But it misses the point. It all misses the point, because what it's really about are these folks. It is about mind-altering substances that destroy human life, that destroy societies and families, and create the violence that you see a couple of blocks from where we are. The reason that we have drug policy, the reason that we're talking about all of this, is not because somebody once upon a time came up with an idea that we need to get tough, just say no. It's that these drugs are destroying people's lives. They're destroying societies and families, and in the worst case, they're undermining civilization. They're creating instability among nation states. These drug traffickers tend to thrive in areas of poorly governed or ungoverned space. And left to their own devices, they become so powerful that they challenge the nation state. It's indisputable. I don't think any of my colleagues will dispute that these drugs are not good for you. The question is really, what are we going to do about them? Harmless marijuana. I spent a few years of my career up in New York as the special agent in charge up there, and there was the cover of the New York Post one day, a little boy by the name of Deshaun Johnson, shot dead in a crossfire between two Jamaican posses, fighting it out over what turned out to be less than a pound of marijuana. These are not victimless crimes. Meth orphans, a new term coined in the 20th century. Parents who are so incapacitated that they can't take care of their children. Meth labs that are set up in places of public accommodation where every horizontal and vertical surface is contaminated. You have children living in these places. Environmental damage? You betcha. And what we see, I was actually supposed to hide this slide, but it proves the point, is that the fact is the drug flow largely, not entirely, largely comes from outside the United States. And there's a reason for that. The reason is that we've got aggressive law enforcement here.